So with that, we welcome back. We have two sessions left today, and the first one is on participation response rates and measurements. So Marco, here's to you.
Thank you, Tara. Yes, so we have 5 presentations in this session, so we are going to leave questions at the end and let presenters go one by one. So we start with Dina Neiger at the Social Research Center at Monash University. Dina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen again. And you should be able to see a picture of Melbourne, if it's working. Yes, good morning, evening, afternoon, morning in Melbourne here, where I am, and thank you for having me here. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors at the Social Research Center, Charles Dove and Paul Myers, who manage the panel, Stats and Methods, Ben Phillips, who is talking later today, and Reward and Jack, who are the statisticians doing a lot of the implementation work. Also, the clients who motivated the work by challenging us to do more with the panel than what we were doing. And of course, our esteemed advisors, Darren Pinay, the founder of the Social Research Center, and Paul Lavrakas, who is here today and presenting later. So before I start, just really quick motivation of why we're talking about longitudinal research on the panel. A few years back, if we were talking about a panel, we would assume that we were doing longitudinal research because that's what panels used to be. They were set up to track people over time. They had careful maintenance procedures. You would have a schedule of waves that would follow a particular population, a group of interest over time. But obviously things have changed a lot with the invent of opt-in online non-probability panels, where it's not so easy to track the sample. And really the purpose of those panels is no longer about longitudinal sample. It's much more about cross-sectional estimates with quick turnaround and cheap. So in an online probability panel space, we sort of found ourselves being a little bit in the middle. We do have respondents who are very committed to the research that we are doing, and I think Sebastian and Paul will probably talk about it later in the presentation. So they do stay over time. We're careful about maintaining their response and keeping them in. But we are also really, the panel is set up for as an alternative, as a high quality mechanism or platform for cross-sectional online research. So while we have a number of people who we can track over time, really as the panel grows and changes, that group becomes smaller as a proportion of the panel. And also there's a conflict in terms of priorities for a particular wave, where we're really looking for accuracy of cross-sectional estimates rather than necessarily a longitudinal sample that doesn't change, that we're tracking from year to year. However, what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is increased pressure for a much more timely data, and also for tracking how the same people have changed their attitudes and their behaviors before, throughout, and after pandemic. And Life in Australia is the only online probability panel in Australia, and really we didn't have other alternatives for researchers to be able to do this research. At the same time, all our normal clients who use the panel for cross-sectional research also wanted to know about COVID. So we had potentially similar related questions being asked repeatedly from the same respondents. We had to grow the panel quite quickly and intensively to make sure that we can meet the research requirements, and also to make sure that it stayed contemporary and representative. And we had the pressure on providing some longitudinal estimates as well. So that's kind of how we found ourselves in the space of, well, how do we find this sort of Goldilocks space for meeting both cross-sectional and longitudinal needs. And there were a number of options that we kind of thought about and rejected. One of them being, well, if we can quarantine a subsample for longitudinal surveys within the panel, our panel neither small enough, so it's not, there are multiple, not the same, it's too big to have the same respondents in every wave. So we have to select a random sample from the panel to create a representative sample for different types of clients. So by quarantining longitudinal sample, we potentially biasing estimates for other people who are not selecting that sample and not necessarily giving the best sample for the longitudinal clients to give a contemporary estimate as well. So it's not big enough where we can just sort of take a little corner of the panel, say that's it, that's your representative longitudinal sample, and everyone else is not impacted. So for this medium-sized panel, then we had a risk of how do we select a longitudinal sample without biasing the rest of the panel estimates, and also giving a good quality estimate to the longitudinal clients. The other option was to go ahead and recruit a fresh longitudinal sample, but that is not as simply done as needed. And also we would have lost the sort of golden pre-COVID data and the historical data of respondents, because by the time we would have recruited them, we would have been halfway through COVID. So what we tried to do is look at the matching sample approach, where we tried to create a balanced sample using propensity response model, where we looked at those panelists who stayed in the panel for a long time. We in this particular example, we took January 2020 as our establishment wave, and then used sample matching to see whether we can exchange respondents, the longitudinal respondents with the cross-sectional respondents, to split the panel into longitudinal and cross-sectional components without creating those biases by just selecting longitudinal sample. So what we try to do, if you imagine you have two clients and one wants a sample of 30% of the panel and the other one will take the rest of the panel, our normal approach would be to select a random sample within a stratified random sample with a panel, so both samples are representative of the population or balanced within the panel. If you do that, and the red dots on this picture represent the long-term or longitudinal response that we want to track over time, you would have 30% of them in the sample and 70% outside of the longitudinal sample, if assuming 30% is your longitudinal requirement. What we'd like to get to really is this kind of situation where most of the longitudinal sample consists of people who've been in the panel for a long time, but still keep this side of the panel representative and being able to provide good estimates. So the way we've done that is we've trialed that on one wave in January 2022 using January 2020 as the establishment wave. And we've assigned 5 propensity classes, which basically models the probability of a cross-sectional or fresher respondent, if you like, being one of the older longitudinal respondents. And we assigned those classes within each stratum. I think we actually assigned 10, but for the purpose of illustration, I'm just using 5. And as you can see, within each stratum, some of the longitudinal respondents were more like in the same class as the cross-sectional, and some weren't. So once we were able to assign all the probability of being in the longitudinal sample, we were then able to swap those respondents from the random sample, from the longitudinal sample in and out to create sort of this this objective for us, where we had two random cross-sectional sample, but one heavily biased towards longitudinal respondents. What was really encouraging for us is when we looked at the demographic distribution, and we used a wide range of variables from our profile to do that, because we have the profile for all the panelists. We found that there was negligible change in the demographic distribution across most of those variables, and our high rate, and we had a rate of replacement of was very high. So we managed to capture 92% of our longitudinal respondents in the longitudinal sample, while providing very high quality cross-sectional estimates that were, I think, within two decimal points of the official statistics for one of the variables of interest. There's still work for us to do. One being is the actual definition of longitudinal sample. So in this particular case, we took January 2020 wave, but as with all longitudinal sample, how do you define? Is it someone who answered the maximum number of waves? Is it someone who was in a particular combination of waves? So this is really something that we're working with the clients on, to try and understand, kind of select the optimal sample to meet the research needs. And we're yet to figure out, if we have 5 different longitudinal clients and have 5 different longitudinal samples, how that would work and what we're going to do with that. Other issues that we're still working on is and need to monitor carefully, is to make sure that we are not overloading a particular type of respondent, and issues of conditioning and retention rate as well, both for the longitudinal and other panelists in the sample. And continuing to make sure that if we fix the longitudinal sample going forward and don't keep trying to create a new one. So if we created one in January, that becomes longitudinal sample for the next 12 to 18 months, or however long the client needs to keep it, that we are we are doesn't drift.
Time, so just,
I'm done.
Including perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.